late in January 1975, a 17-year-old girl called Vera Branders walked out onto the stage of the Cologne Opera House. And she looked out over 1,400 seats, all empty. The lights were off. The room was lit only by the dim green glow of the emergency exit signs. But this was the most exciting day of Vera's life, because in just a few hours, Keith Jarrett would be on stage. And Vera was the youngest concert promoter in Germany, just 17 years old. She'd managed to persuade the Cologne Opera House to host this late-night performance of improvised jazz. Jarrett would be playing the piano without sheet music, without rehearsal, just whatever idea came into his head. But Branders was on the stage to introduce Jarrett to the piano in question, and it was not going well. So Jarrett looked at the piano. He played a few notes, shook his head. His producer came over, tried a chord. They talked. Vera's feeling pretty nervous. And then Jarrett's producer comes over and says, "If you don't get a new piano, Keith won't play." There'd been some kind of mistake. The Opera House crew had brought a rehearsal piano onto the stage. So it was beaten up and worn down. The felt was missing on the upper keys, so they sounded tinny. Pedals didn't work. Some keys were stuck. Everything was out of tune. And worst of all, it was not a concert piano. Branders said it was like a tiny piano, like half a piano. So it wasn't loud enough to fill the auditorium. It was unplayable. And of course, Keith Jarrett didn't want to play it. So he left, leaving Vera to try to get a new piano. Turns out it just wasn't possible, not enough time. She got a piano tuner to try and fix some of it, but really there was only one thing that she could do. She went outside, it was raining, and she saw Keith Jarrett in his car waiting to be driven to the hotel. And she went up to him, knocked on the window, got down to make eye contact. And she begged him. She begged him to play. And Keith Jarrett looked out at this rain-drenched teenager, thought about what was going to happen if the concert was cancelled, and said, "Never forget. Only for you." And so, a few hours later, Keith Jarrett walked out alone on stage in front of 1,400 people. He sat down at a piano that he knew was unplayable, and he began. And within moments, it became clear that something magical was happening. So Jarrett was avoiding those harsh upper notes. He was sticking to the middle keys in the piano, which gave the music this very soothing, ambient quality. But because the piano was so quiet, he was setting up these rumbling, repetitive riffs in the bass to try to create some resonance. And he was standing up, pounding down on the keyboard, trying to get enough noise out of this stupid instrument to fill the auditorium. And this dynamic tension between the soothing harmonies he was playing and the force with which he was playing it just was electrifying. The audience loved it. And audiences continue to love it because Keith Jarrett's producer decided he was going to record this concert so that he had documentary evidence of what a musical catastrophe sounds like. But they didn't get a catastrophe. They got the Cologne concert, the best-selling solo jazz piano album in history. Keith Jarrett was handed this mess, and he didn't want to engage with it, but in the end, when he was forced to, he soared. But what I've been thinking recently is maybe we're all kind of Keith Jarrett. being forced to play this unplayable piano, refusing, being unwilling, complaining. And then when we actually engage with the problem, we find to our astonishment that we're producing the best work of our lives. I want to talk about why that happens. And I'll give you examples from the classroom, from the labor market, and yes, another amazing musical performance in Germany. But let me start with the classroom. So there's a really fun study conducted by a psychologist called Daniel Oppenheimer, who worked with high school teachers. And what he got them to do was to format their handouts for their students. Some students got the handouts in standard fonts like Times New Roman or Helvetica. You know, easy to read, everyone knows these fonts. And then some students chosen at random got the same handouts, but the fonts would be things like Hattenschweiler, or, you guessed it, Comic Sans italicized. Now, these are ugly fonts. They're difficult to read. You know, you don't typeset a whole novel in Hattenschweiler. It's for titles and playbills and things. But weirdly, what Oppenheimer found was that the students who had to read they're called disfluent fonts, the ugly fonts, the difficult fonts, they did better in their exams. Why? Well, because when they saw this weird handout, they started paying attention. They slowed down, they engaged, they focused. The obstacle makes us focused. The obstacle makes us alert. And that's one of the reasons why the obstacle produces these amazing performances. Now, no talk about creativity in 2024 would be complete without some discussion of generative AI. And, you know, I'm a writer. I worry about generative AI. And people come to me, they worry about generative AI, and they say, I'm really worried that it's going to be disruptive. And then I think, yeah, you know what I'm more worried about? I'm more worried that it's not going to be disruptive. I'm more worried that we're going to embrace this technology into our lives, and we're going to get comfortable, and we're going to get lazy, and we're going to forget what it even means to create, and how important creativity is, not just as a way of making a living, although we all like to make a living, but as a way of being a human. And let me give you an example of why I'm worried about this, although I'm sure you can all imagine. So there was a study done recently by an academic at Harvard Business School called Fabrizio Dell'Acqua. And he wasn't using generative AI, he was using a kind of decision support AI. But he gave it to recruiters who were trying to recruit people for jobs. And at random, he said, okay, you guys, you're going to get a really good AI. You guys, you're going to get a kind of good AI that sometimes makes mistakes. You guys, no AI at all. So what do you think happened? Well, the ones who got no AI at all, they didn't do a great job. The AI was really helpful. People made better decisions. But weirdly, the people with the best AI didn't make the best decisions. It was the people with the imperfect AI, kind of like the unplayable piano. And why did they make better decisions? Because the people with the best AI, they got lazy. Great, press the button, let the AI choose. I don't care, it doesn't bother me. Whereas the people with an AI that they didn't completely trust, they used it, they gained from it, but they also used their own judgment. Fabrizio Dell'Acqua's study is called Falling Asleep at the Wheel. And falling asleep at the wheel is what I am worried is going to happen to us when the AI takes over. But I'm not too worried, because I know that creative people always embrace new tools, and they're always trying to hack them and do weird things with them and push themselves out of their comfort zones. And I know also that we're not going to stop collaborating with each other. We're not going to stop collaborating with other humans. And you know, one thing that you can absolutely guarantee is going to be a source of obstacles is other humans. There's a great little study, one more study about this. It was conducted by a psychologist called Catherine Phillips and her colleagues. And what she did was to get people in small groups to solve a problem. They had about 20 minutes. It was quite a complicated problem, multiple choice, 3 answers, A, B, C. And some of them, chosen at random, were groups of 4 friends, and some, 3 friends, 1 stranger, for maximum awkwardness. Now, the groups of 4 friends got the problem right about 50% of the time, which is not great. Remember, it's multiple choice, there's 3 options, 50% is not great. But the groups with 3 friends, 1 stranger, they got the problem right 75% of the time. It's much better performance. But that's despite the fact the stranger didn't have any new information, the stranger didn't have any new skills. It was just, the conversation was just kind of more awkward, and the awkwardness helped people solve the problem. But what's really interesting about this study is how people felt about it. Because Catherine Phillips interviewed all the people who had participated, and the ones who'd been with their friends, who, remember, didn't do very well, they said, we had a great time, we had a high-quality conversation, and we think we solved the problem. Whereas the people who were with the awkward stranger, who did much better, they said, we didn't enjoy the conversation, we don't think it was a good conversation, and we're not confident that we solved the problem. It's incredible. You've got the awkward stranger in the middle of you, helping you be your best self, helping you solve problems, and you don't even know it's happening. Which, of course, brings us back to Jarrett again. It's the same thing over and over again. We don't want this stuff to happen. We don't want the unplayable piano. We don't want the ugly fault. But sometimes when we're forced to embrace it, we do better. Which got me thinking about Brian Eno. So Brian Eno, of course, an amazing composer, artist, producer, and collaborator. And I had the privilege of interviewing Brian about all this stuff. And he's worked, of course, with Devo and with U2 and with Coldplay, Twyla Tharp. He's worked with everybody. And often, bands bring him in to collaborate with them because he's the awkward stranger, right? He is the unplayable piano. He's going to break their routines and mess them up. And they know that it's going to help. They know that it's going to produce a more creative process. And of course, one of the most famous things that Eno did was when he was working with David Bowie in the Hansa Studios in Berlin. And he had this deck of cards. I mean, not actually this deck of cards, I wish. But this deck of cards, the oblique strategies. And originally, he just had these weird ideas on the wall. And ideas to maybe mix things up. And he'd look at the ideas on the wall and he'd pick one. And then he realized that doesn't work. Because you always pick the one that's easiest. It only works if you have the cards, and then you have to take a card at random and do what it says. So, for example, this is a favorite. Change instrument roles. Oh, brilliant. You've got the greatest guitarist in the world and the greatest drummer in the world, but the guitarist is on the drums and the drummer is on the guitar. I mean, what a stupid idea. What a stupid idea. Heroes, an amazing single. Carlos Alomar is on the drums. Brilliant guitarist, playing the drums, really pissed off. That's the thing about these cards. They're disruptive. I mean, they are deliberately disruptive. Here's a destroy the most important thing. Discover the recipes you're using and abandon them. I'll let you into a secret about these cards. The musicians hate them. Phil Collins was collaborating with Eno. He got so frustrated he'd throw beer cans across the studio. Carlos Alomar would turn to him and say, Brian, this experiment is stupid. And it's only 40 years later that you look back and you go, wow, that was Heroes. That was Lodger. Maybe it was stupid, but the albums are pretty good. And I heard not long ago that apparently Carlos Alomar grew to use the cards. He started using them with his students. He said, I need them to feel the way I felt on stage. Maybe 40 years later, he realized just because you hate it doesn't mean it isn't helping you. So that's why we need to keep embracing these obstacles, finding ways to force ourselves to do it. Maybe it's the stupid, ugly font. Maybe it's the awkward stranger. Maybe it's one of these cards. But all of us, from time to time, we need to find a way to force ourselves to sit down and to play the unplayable piano. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Thank you.